Good afternoon. My name is Sherman, and we're going to talk about the Uncivil War. I thought Uncivil was a pretty cool name for it. I didn't come up with it. It's been used over and over again by a lot of different people. It seems like very few people thought the war was very civil. But we call it the War for Southern Independence, or we call it the War of Northern Aggression. We don't call it the Civil War. And I have a picture here that she is going to zoom in on. And this is a very special picture to me. I have a whole home full of Confederate art, mostly by John Paul Strain. But this is my favorite. This is an original done just for me, watercolor by John Paul Strain, and it shows a Confederate. Well, this one was actually a cadet. He was from the University of Alabama when all the students, toward the end of the war, got together and decided that they were going to join the cause. And not too long after that, the Yankees burned the university down. But for lack of a better word, we'll call him Johnny Reb. Typical Confederate soldiers, about 18 years old, came from very humble means. Most of them didn't know how to read or write. Most of them didn't own a pair of shoes. Most of them never traveled more than 4 or 5 miles away from home. They were strong Christians, very into family, very into country, very into home. One of the things about the War of Northern Aggression is that if you ask anybody what the war was about, 99% of the people will say that it was about slavery. That the war was fought for slavery, that the North was trying to free the slaves and the South was trying to hang on to the slaves. And hang on to their way of life, and hang on to their way of doing things. And I wanted to talk about the average Confederate soldier today. Not going to take a lot of time, but just point out a few things that I think are really important. The war was not about slavery. Slavery was a big part of it, and the reason it was a part of it was because slavery was what fueled the Southern economy. Slavery made the whole economy work. What the war was really about was about money. That's what the war was truly about, money. And what you have to do is you have to take yourself back into the 1850s and the 1860s. You can't take a look at the war with modern day eyes and look back on it and ever begin to understand it. If you look back on it with modern day eyes, you just say that the Southerners who owned slaves were just a bunch of bigots, a bunch of racists, and they just, put an adjective on it. Now, it's true that slavery was terrible and never should have happened in this country, never should have happened anywhere. But it's important to understand a couple things. The Southerners who took part in the Civil War did not start slavery. Slavery was going on in this country 200 years before they were born. The father of our country, George Washington, owned 200 slaves. Very few people know that, but he did. Thomas Jefferson owned a couple hundred slaves. Andrew Jackson owned a couple. All presidents of the United States, all founding fathers of our nation, and on and on. It had been going on in this country for a long time. It was an institution. The people who lived in the South at the time of the war were born into that society. They were born into the fact that white people used and kept slaves to fuel the Southern economy. Slavery was going on in many nations around the world, not just in the United States. France dealt in slaves. England dealt in slaves. Slaves were taken to all kinds of different countries all over the world, from Africa mostly, and used there, not just in the southern United States. So it had been going on for a long time. And it's important to understand how the southern people fit into all of that. Let's talk about our little guy for a second here. He's about 18 years old, has never been more than about 5 miles from home. He didn't join the Confederate Army and risk his life and travel to faraway battlefields and bleed and die so that rich Southerners could keep their slaves. He could have cared less about slavery. He didn't own any slaves. He probably didn't know anybody that owned any slaves. He may not have even seen any slaves in his area. So the idea that all these boys joined the army and went to fight so that the slavery deal could go on, that's just not true. On the same token, the northern soldiers were the same. Those boys didn't get up off a farm in Indiana and go to war and bleed and die to try to stop slavery. It wasn't all about that. The southern boys went to war because they felt like the northerners were invading their nation. They were doing it to protect their homes and their homelands. That's how they looked at it. These people right here, like this young man, we'll call him Johnny Reb, Connecticut was light years away from him. He'd never been out of Alabama. It's not like today where you get on a plane, you go any place you want to go. These guys, I mean, the Yankees coming down here, they looked at them as foreign invaders. So they weren't going to war and risking their life to keep slavery going. The idea that the North was fighting for slavery, I mean, if the war was all about slavery, why is it that the Union Army didn't just march into these areas and go to a plantation and free the slaves? It was all about freeing the slaves. Why didn't they just go free slaves? They didn't do that. And why is it that the Northerners didn't do anything at all about slavery for decades? They didn't do a thing about it. Not one thing about it. They also wanted to keep the status quo going. Because you see, the North was making a ton of money off the tariffs. The tariffs were put in place on Southern exports. Cotton crops, tobacco crops, the Southerners would gather them, they ship them overseas, and there was big tariffs that were put on those by the United States government. The Northerners didn't have any of that. The South had the crops, they had the tariffs. The North needed the South to be successful, to ship crops so they could gather their tariffs because they needed the money. There was no income tax back then, there was no sales tax back then. They needed the tariff money. When Lincoln was elected, the South was sick and tired of the tariffs. They were trying to get rid of it. The Southern congressmen and senators were outnumbered in Congress, much like when the Democrats forced the Obamacare thing through. The Southern representatives and the Southern senators, they couldn't stop the tariffs. They couldn't get rid of them. They were outvoted. They were overruled. And they felt helpless. And they felt sequestered. And they felt like they were put upon. And they didn't like it. They felt like their freedom was been taken away. They didn't think it was right that they should have to pay these tariffs, and they didn't want to do it. And when they saw Lincoln come into office, they know it was going to get worse. The Southerners decided then to leave the Union. It was all about money. Now, was it about slavery? In a way it was, because they needed the slaves to fuel their economy. But let me tell you a story that very few people know. Do you know that President Lincoln offered the southern states an amendment to the United States Constitution, not an executive order he was going to sign, but an amendment to the Constitution. At the time, I believe it was the 13th Amendment, because we didn't have one then. And the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was going to be that the United States government would in no way mess with slavery. They weren't going to try to stop it. They weren't going to outlaw it. They weren't going to come down and try to do away with it. They were going to leave it alone. All the Southerners had to do was not secede from the Union. If the Southerners were really seceding and fighting and dying just to keep slavery, all they would have had to do was say yes to Lincoln and the 13th Amendment, and there would have been no reason to fight the war. None whatsoever. No, it was all about money. It was all about money. It was all about the tariffs. You know? And I think what we want to do is we want to stop it here now because we've gone a little bit too long. But I want you to know that from a different perspective about the war, a different way, that's what we're going to try to do. We're going to try to look at it from a Southern point of view. And we're going to try to put ourselves in the places of these guys. Why did they go fight the war? Why did Lincoln muster troops and invade Northern Virginia? Why did he just say, okay, let me tell you something. The Southerners joined the Union of their own free will. All of the Southern states became a part of the Union of their own free will. So they had a right to leave of their own free will. But Lincoln said, no, 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 no. You're not going anywhere. Why aren't they going anywhere? Because we need the money. We got to have these tariffs. We can't function without it. The United States as we know it can't work without all this Southern money. We need your crops. We need your cotton. We need your tobacco. We need your money. It was all about money. Thank you very much.